DENIS Diderot, one of the towering figures of the French Enlightenment, was born on October 5, 1713, in Langres, a provincial town in the Champagne region of France. His father, Didier Diderot, was a master cutler, an artisan renowned for his craft, and his mother, Angélique Vigneron, came from a family of local tradesmen. The Diderot household was modest but relatively stable, and young Denis grew up within the structures of traditional bourgeois values, centered around discipline, hard work, and a deep respect for Catholic orthodoxy. From an early age, Denis exhibited signs of a precocious intellect and an intense curiosity about the world around him. Recognizing his potential, his parents were determined to provide him with the best education available to someone of their standing. At the age of 12, Denis was enrolled in the Jesuit-run College de Juilly, a prestigious preparatory school that catered to the sons of the French middle class aspiring to clerical or professional careers. The rigorous curriculum, steeped in Latin, rhetoric, and scholastic philosophy, would serve as the foundation of Diderot's later intellectual development. The Jesuits at Juilly imbued their students with a traditionalist worldview, emphasizing theological orthodoxy and submission to ecclesiastical authority. However, the seeds of critical thinking were paradoxically sown within this environment. In mastering the methods of scholastic debate, young Denis learned how to argue effectively, to question assumptions, and to seek logical consistency, skills that would later fuel his break with the religious certainties of his upbringing. Upon completing his studies at Juilly, Diderot pursued higher education in Paris, the vibrant capital that was rapidly becoming a center for new intellectual movements. He enrolled at the College de Harcourt, part of the University of Paris, where he broadened his studies to include mathematics, classical literature, philosophy, and the natural sciences. It was here that Diderot first encountered the tension between traditional scholasticism and the emerging currents of rationalism and scientific inquiry that characterized the Enlightenment. The intellectual climate of Paris in the early 18th century was one of ferment and contradiction. While the Catholic Church and the monarchy maintained a tight grip on institutional life, clandestine circles of freethinkers and reformists were beginning to question the traditional order. Although still young and relatively inexperienced, Diderot gravitated toward these radical circles, finding himself increasingly disillusioned with the dogmas of his Jesuit education. His family, particularly his father, hoped that Denis would enter the clergy, a path that would guarantee both prestige and stability. Diderot initially appeared to comply, taking minor religious orders and even wearing clerical dress for a time. However, inwardly, he was wrestling with profound doubts about religious doctrine and the authority of the Church. His internal conflict culminated in a decisive break. Denis abandoned his clerical ambitions and chose instead a precarious life as a man of letters. This decision led to an inevitable rupture with his family, particularly with his father, who was deeply disappointed and angered by his son's perceived ingratitude and rebellion. Diderot's choice to pursue an independent intellectual life plunged him into financial instability. For several years, he eked out a meager existence in Paris, taking on translations, tutoring jobs, and small writing assignments, an experience that grounded his later commitment to challenging the social structures that limited human potential. Despite the hardships, these early years of poverty and estrangement were formative. They hardened Diderot's resolve and imbued him with a deep empathy for the marginalized and the oppressed, a sentiment that would permeate much of his later philosophical and literary work. Moreover, his first-hand exposure to the precariousness of intellectual life outside institutional protection reinforced his belief in the necessity of freedom of thought and expression. In his early 20s, Diderot began to forge relationships with other young thinkers and writers who shared his passion for knowledge and his disdain for orthodoxy. These associations exposed him to a wider array of ideas, from the empiricism of Locke to the mechanistic physics of Newton, as well as to early stirrings of materialist and atheist thought. Diderot's intellectual horizon expanded rapidly, and his appetite for learning became insatiable. Thus, by the end of his formal education and early adulthood, Diderot had already laid the groundwork for the radical thinker he would become. His upbringing instilled in him the intellectual tools and discipline necessary for serious scholarship, while his personal experiences of rebellion, hardship, and intellectual discovery ignited the critical spirit that would define his contribution to the Enlightenment. The child of Langres had embarked on a path that would eventually challenge the very foundations of European thought. In the narrow streets of Paris, where the clang of carriage wheels mingled with the cries of merchants and the solemn tolling of church bells, Denis Diderot walked with a restless heart. Around him, the city pulsed with contradictions. Gilded cathedrals loomed over crumbling tenements, and the scholars who taught piety by day whispered radical ideas in wine-soaked taverns by night. Diderot, in these early wanderings, was caught between two worlds, one promising eternal salvation, the other daring him to seize knowledge for its own sake. Paris in the 1730s was not merely a backdrop to Diderot's transformation. It was an active participant. The city, ancient yet feverishly modernizing, teased young minds with the scent of forbidden books and the chatter of underground salons. It was in this tumultuous setting that Diderot first tasted the exhilaration of forbidden thought, far from the watchful eyes of his provincial upbringing. At first, Diderot clung to the familiar. He donned the black garb of a cleric and repeated prayers he no longer felt with conviction. Yet, each rote utterance left a bitter taste on his tongue. The doctrines he had memorized in Langres seemed increasingly hollow in the shadow of the Sorbonne's ancient stones. His heart, once moved by the grandeur of the Mass, now quickened at the sound of lively debates about reason, science, and human nature. It was not a single book or conversation that turned Diderot away from the church, but rather an accumulation of small revelations. He heard whispers about Voltaire, who dared to mock sacred institutions with razor-sharp wit. He encountered the empirical philosophies of John Locke, whose insistence on experience as the sole source of knowledge challenged the very foundations of theological certainty. Every new idea he encountered loosened another brick from the towering edifice of faith he had inherited. Diderot found himself irresistibly drawn to the clandestine gatherings of free thinkers. In smoky taverns tucked behind respectable facades, he listened intently to merchants, students, and disillusioned priests who debated ideas considered dangerous by the authorities. Conversations ranged from critiques of monarchy to speculative discussions about the nature of the soul. These gatherings awakened a part of Diderot that had long chafed under the rigid disciplines of his education. The more he absorbed, the more he realized that his mind could not return to its former obedience. Religion, once a luminous guide, had become a chain. He did not merely doubt the dogmas he had been taught. He began to see the entire structure of religious authority as a system designed to suppress inquiry and stifle human potential. A different kind of reverence took root in him, reverence for truth wherever it might lead. Diderot's outward rebellion was gradual but determined. He shed his clerical garb, first by small acts of defiance, a missing prayer, a skeptical glance, and eventually by walking away altogether. To many who knew him, the transformation seemed abrupt and scandalous. Yet to Diderot himself, it was as natural as a river carving a new course after a storm. Inevitable, powerful and deeply personal. Living now without the support of either family or church, Diderot embraced a precarious freedom. Each day was a battle for survival. He wrote translations of English works, edited legal documents, and took on tutoring jobs, none of which promised financial security. But what he lacked in wealth, he gained in intellectual riches. His small rented rooms, cluttered with secondhand books and half-finished manuscripts, became sanctuaries of relentless questioning. As the seasons turned and the bells of Paris marked the passing years, Diderot transformed from a boy molded by tradition into a man fueled by doubt and curiosity. He felt the burden of his independence keenly. Loneliness often pressed against him like a second skin. Yet, in the solitude of his studies, he found a fierce joy. The realization that the world was a place to be understood through reason and passion, not submission and fear. By the time the first wrinkles touched his brow, Diderot had already committed himself to a lifelong journey that would pit him against kings, priests, and even fellow philosophers. The seeds of rebellion, planted in the quiet disillusionment of his youth, had blossomed into a relentless thirst for knowledge. No authority, sacred or secular, would again command his blind obedience. He had chosen the path of freedom, a path that would lead him into both glory and peril. In the heart of Paris, where narrow alleys opened into bustling squares and the Seine carved its slow, deliberate path through the city, the air shimmered with ideas as tangible as the smell of roasting chestnuts from street vendors. Denis Diderot, now a man of the city, moved through these animated streets with an attentive eye and an eager mind. Paris in those years was not simply a collection of stones and spires. It was a living organism, breathing philosophy, dissent, and hope into all who dared listen. The salons, those semi-private gatherings of writers, thinkers, and aristocrats, became Diderot's new classrooms. Beyond the heavy curtains and crystal chandeliers of Parisian drawing rooms, conversations flowed as freely as the wine. Here, baronesses and scribblers debated with equal fervor the rights of man, the purpose of art, and the mechanisms of government. In these polished yet combustible circles, Diderot first found a sense of belonging among others who dared to think beyond convention. Unlike the cloistered academies and rigid universities, the salons prized wit, skepticism, and imagination. They were theaters of the mind where a clever turn of phrase could earn admiration, and a bold idea could set the room humming. Diderot, armed with his voracious intellect and an almost reckless honesty, soon became a familiar figure in these gatherings, though he lacked the polish and pedigree of many of his contemporaries. The cafes of Paris were a different kind of agora. Beneath the cracked ceilings of establishments like the Café Procope, students, pamphleteers, and budding revolutionaries hunched over greasy tables, arguing in a dozen dialects. Diderot frequented these smoky rooms as well, drawn to their rawness and democratic energy. Unlike the salons, the cafes did not demand elegance, only passion, reason, and the willingness to have one's ideas tested and battered by others. In quiet moments, Diderot wandered the bookstalls along the Seine, where banned pamphlets and smuggled philosophical treatises were sold beneath loose boards and sly glances. The underground market of ideas thrived in Paris, defying censorship with an almost mischievous delight. Here, Diderot found not just works by Locke and Newton, but also the radical tracts of La Mettrie, Bell, and other thinkers who dared to suggest that morality and reason might exist without divine authority. Yet Paris offered more than just intellectual ferment. Its art galleries, theaters, and public lectures awakened other passions in Diderot. Standing before the bold canvases of Watteau and Chardin, he glimpsed new possibilities for human expression, listening to dramatists rail against tyranny in veiled allegories. He realized that truth could wear many costumes, sometimes donning the finery of fiction to slip past the censors. Friendships bloomed in this vibrant soil. Among Diderot's companions were Jean-Jacques Rousseau, then a struggling musician with grandiose dreams, and Etienne Benoît de Condillac, whose investigations into human perception fascinated Diderot deeply. These relationships were not always easy. Egos clashed and alliances shifted, but they provided Diderot with a community of minds wrestling with the same vast, unsettling questions. Despite the exhilaration of these new experiences, Diderot also faced the bitter realities of survival. Paris was an expensive, unforgiving city, and intellectual enthusiasm could not pay a landlord's demands. He often lived hand-to-mouth, selling translations, offering private lessons, and undertaking menial literary commissions. Each coin earned through such labor reinforced his understanding of the precariousness of freedom in a society still chained to privilege and tradition. In these years, Diderot's sense of purpose began to sharpen. The casual debates of the salons, the raucous arguments in the cafes, the secret pages pressed into his hand at a market stall. All of it convinced him that knowledge was not a private luxury, but a public necessity. Ideas had to be wrested from the control of elites and made accessible to every man and woman capable of thinking for themselves. Enlightenment, he began to believe, must not remain locked in salons but flood the streets like a rising tide. In a modest attic overlooking the twisted rooftops of Paris, Denis Diderot leaned over a battered desk, his fingers stained with ink, his candle guttering against the dark. It was here, amid the groan of settling timbers and the distant clatter of nighttime carts, that he wrestled with the fragile beginnings of his literary career. His ambition was vast, but his means were few, and each word laid on the page felt like a small rebellion against the anonymity that threatened to swallow him whole. The path to recognition was treacherous for a man like Diderot, who lacked aristocratic patrons and refused to pander to fashionable tastes. He took whatever work he could find, often ghostwriting for established authors or composing translations of English and classical works for paltry sums. These early commissions demanded long hours and yielded little glory, yet they sharpened his prose, teaching him to move between languages and ideas with increasing fluency. One of his first significant ventures into independent authorship came with his translation of Shaftesbury's Inquiry Concerning Virtue. In rendering the English moralist's elegant arguments into French, Diderot did more than translate. He absorbed. Shaftesbury's emphasis on natural morality, free from religious sanction, resonated deeply with the emerging convictions Diderot was fashioning in his private reflections. Even as he completed the task for hire, he secretly treated it as an apprenticeship in a new, liberating mode of thought. Yet translation could not contain the restless energy stirring within him. Soon, Diderot began to experiment with works of his own, pieces that dared to bear his name. His early essays and pamphlets often carried the tentative air of a man feeling his way toward an original voice. Some texts were philosophical musings. Others flirted with fiction, blending observation and imagination in ways that would later become his signature. The marketplace, however, was indifferent to innovation, and sales were scarce. Financial desperation often haunted his creative life. There were days when Diderot pawned his coat to buy paper and ink, nights when hunger gnawed at him as fiercely as any ambition. Yet hardship did not embitter him. It deepened his empathy for the human condition. The characters who populated his early sketches, artisans, soldiers, merchants, bore the marks of lived experience, infused with a dignity that polite society often denied them. In these formative years, Diderot also began to cultivate a distinctive style, one that refused to separate thought from feeling. He eschewed the cold, geometrical clarity that many of his contemporaries prized, preferring a prose that moved with the rhythms of conversation, rich with digressions, contradictions, and sudden bursts of insight. It was a style that baffled some critics, but enchanted those who sensed the new spirit stirring in French letters. Despite his literary efforts, Diderot remained largely invisible to the wider world of Parisian intellectuals. The prestigious academies, guarded by strict protocols and rigid hierarchies, seemed worlds away from the noisy garrets and smoky cafes he inhabited. His poverty, his lack of connections, and his stubborn refusal to flatter the powerful kept him on the margins, a spectator rather than a player in the grand salons of literary Paris. Yet obscurity had its advantages. Free from the expectations of patrons and the constraints of polite society, Diderot was able to experiment boldly. He toyed with paradoxes, imagined conversations between fictional philosophers, and sketched scenarios that questioned the nature of reality itself. Each small, unheralded work was a stepping stone, carrying him further away from the safe shores of tradition and deeper into uncharted intellectual waters. Among his most daring early compositions was Philosophical Thoughts, a slender volume published anonymously. In it, Diderot challenged conventional morality, suggested that virtue could exist without divine reward, and hinted at the radical idea that religious institutions might hinder rather than help human flourishing. Though modest in appearance, the work caught the attention of authorities, and whispers of censorship began to circulate, a sign that Diderot's voice, however faint, was beginning to disturb the established order. Through perseverance and audacity, Diderot carved out a precarious niche for himself, the role of an outsider who, precisely because he owed nothing to the guardians of orthodoxy, could think and write with an independence rare in his age. His early struggles against poverty, obscurity, and the inertia of convention forged not just a writer, but a revolutionary mind preparing to unleash ideas that would one day echo across the entire continent. The idea arrived not with fanfare, but almost by accident. A publishing project, modest at first, merely to translate Chambers's English cyclopedia into French. Yet in the dimly lit rooms where printers met philosophers and plans were whispered over wine, the project began to swell in the imagination of Denis Diderot into something vast, something that might alter the destiny of thought itself. No longer a simple translation, it would become a monument, a compendium of all human knowledge, unfettered by superstition, dedicated to reason. At the beginning, there was only the fragile seed of an ambition. Parisian publishers, eager to profit from the growing appetite for learning among the bourgeoisie, sought someone energetic enough to oversee the unwieldy task of translation and organization. Diderot, already known in limited circles for his sharp mind and prodigious work ethic, seemed a convenient choice. But what the publishers envisioned as a routine enterprise, Diderot reimagined as a battlefield upon which the old and new worlds would collide. The project demanded collaborators, and soon Diderot set about gathering them like a general recruiting an army. He sought out the brightest minds of his generation, mathematicians who could chart the invisible, artists who could reveal the sublime, engineers who could reshape nature itself. Among them came Jean-Louis Rondelenberg, a brilliant mathematician who would initially share editorial duties, lending scientific rigor to the sprawling enterprise. Diderot envisioned the encyclopedia not simply as a repository of facts, but as a tool of liberation. Each entry would illuminate a corner of the vast human experience, stripping away ignorance and prejudice like the clearing of a dense forest. It was a project that aimed not merely to inform, but to transform. The common reader, equipped with knowledge once reserved for kings and clergy, could become a freer, more rational being. The work began in earnest in 1747, and with it came the first whiff of danger. From the outset, the authorities eyed the enterprise with suspicion. Knowledge, in the hands of the many, threatened the carefully maintained hierarchies of church and state. Censors demanded edits, omissions, polite fictions. Diderot, outwardly compliant, inwardly seethed. His pen became a weapon, sly and subtle. His entries often contained veiled criticisms, couched in the language of objectivity. Coordinating the encyclopedia was a Herculean labor. Manuscripts piled up on Diderot's cramped desk. Treatises on anatomy, instructions for manufacturing textiles, diagrams of agricultural machines. Every discipline was welcome, from the mechanical to the metaphysical. Diderot read, revised, corrected, and cross-referenced with a tenacity that astonished even his closest allies. His home became a buzzing hive of intellectual activity, visited constantly by writers, draftsmen, engravers, and restless philosophers. Amid this torrent of information, Diderot faced constant battles, with printers who delayed or overcharged, with contributors who missed deadlines, and, most perilously, with the shadowy forces of censorship. Royal and ecclesiastical authorities exerted growing pressure, forcing periodic shutdowns of the project. At times, it seemed the encyclopedia might collapse under the weight of its own ambition and the hostility it provoked. Yet each obstacle only hardened Diderot's resolve. When official permissions were revoked, he continued the work in secret, coordinating clandestine meetings with printers outside Paris, organizing contributors under pseudonyms, and smuggling manuscripts past censors with the help of sympathetic allies. The encyclopedia thus became not only an intellectual enterprise, but an act of resistance, a quiet revolution fought with words instead of weapons. In the cracks of official disapproval, Diderot inserted seeds of subversion. Articles on government praised constitutional monarchy. Entries on religion hinted at the sufficiency of reason and the possibility of virtue without divine reward. Even the technical articles, how to forge steel, build looms, improve farming, carried revolutionary implications. They suggested a world where knowledge, not birthright, conferred power. As volumes of the encyclopedia finally began to roll off the presses, wrapped in thick paper and carried carefully to bookstores and private salons, the world began to shift. Readers in Paris and beyond discovered in its pages a vision of humanity freed from the chains of ignorance. The sky over Paris darkened in more ways than one during the early 1750s. As volumes of the encyclopedia circulated, their radical undercurrents stirred the ire of powerful forces. Behind the polished doors of government offices and ecclesiastical councils, discussions grew tense. The project was no longer seen as a harmless curiosity. It was a threat, a slow-acting poison seeping into the veins of society. Denis Diderot, once a relatively obscure figure, had become a marked man. The first blow fell quietly. Royal censors revoked the official license of the encyclopedia, citing concerns over its dangerous tendencies. In the streets and cafes, rumors swirled. Lists of subversive writers were being compiled. Secret police observed the gatherings of philosophers, and informants lurked in the most unlikely places. Paris itself seemed to tighten, its bustling life dimmed by the invisible grip of surveillance. Diderot, however, was not easily intimidated. He continued working on the project, moving manuscripts through a labyrinth of secret routes. Yet the cost of defiance soon became personal. One evening, as he walked home from a clandestine meeting with printers, two men in plain clothes seized him without ceremony. They dragged him through the lamplit streets to a grim building on the outskirts of the city, the infamous prison of Vincennes. The cell assigned to Diderot was narrow, its walls damp with centuries of confinement. A single barred window admitted a sliver of light by day and a shard of moon by night. There, amid the silence punctuated only by the distant clanking of chains and the low moans of other prisoners, Diderot confronted the stark reality of his situation. His pen had bought him a cage. His thirst for knowledge had summoned the iron hand of authority. Imprisonment offered no consolation of trial or verdict. Diderot was held without formal charges, a common practice for political prisoners deemed too dangerous for public courtrooms. Days stretched into weeks, measured only by the meager meals slid through the door and the passage of shadows across the cold stone floor. Deprived of his library, his papers, and his companions, he turned inward, wrestling with doubt, rage, and a persistent, defiant hope. Yet even in confinement, Diderot's mind refused to be shackled. Deprived of books, he composed essays in his head, turning over arguments, refining phrases, imagining dialogues between fictitious characters. He clung to memory as a lifeline, reconstructing passages of philosophy, recalling the intricate mechanisms of artisans, retracing the arguments that had filled the pages of the encyclopedia. In his solitude, thought became both a refuge and a weapon. Outside the prison walls, friends and sympathizers worked tirelessly for his release. Letters were penned to influential patrons. Bribes changed hands. Alliances were forged in whispers. Voltaire, though often critical of Diderot's boldness, intervened discreetly. After several months of negotiation and pressure, the authorities relented, calculating that a quiet release would cause less stir than a prolonged imprisonment. On a gray morning, the heavy door swung open, and Diderot stepped back into the uncertain light of freedom. The world he returned to was subtly altered. His reputation had grown, not as a mere writer, but as a symbol of intellectual resistance. Paris now spoke of Diderot with a mixture of admiration and fear. He was no longer merely a participant in the Age of Enlightenment, but one of its embattled standard-bearers. Every article he published, every essay he penned, carried the weight of his imprisonment, a silent reminder of the risks borne by those who dare to think aloud. Yet the ordeal had left scars. Diderot grew more cautious in certain ways, more adept at disguising his criticisms beneath layers of irony and indirection. His writing became sharper, more layered, weaving subversion into apparent orthodoxy. He had learned, through hardship, that survival sometimes demanded cunning as well as courage. In the years that followed, Diderot would continue his colossal work on the encyclopedia, now fully aware of the mortal stakes involved. His imprisonment at Vincennes had taught him a grim but essential lesson, that in an age when truth was treason, every act of thought was an act of rebellion, and that some ideas were worth the risk of chains. After the dark months of confinement and the exhausting battles surrounding the encyclopedia, Denis Diderot sought a new outlet for his restless energies. His gaze turned increasingly toward the stage, the living, breathing world of the theater where ideas could take human form and philosophy could walk and speak before an audience. In the flickering candlelight of Parisian playhouses, Diderot saw a powerful vehicle for shaping hearts as well as minds. Yet Diderot did not approach the theater merely as an entertainment. For him, the stage was a mirror, one that should reflect the true complexities of human experience rather than the artificial contrivances beloved by the traditional French drama. Classical tragedies, with their noble heroes and stylized speeches, seemed to him hollow and distant from the everyday lives of the audience. He dreamed instead of a theater that portrayed real people, grappling with real moral dilemmas. It was in this spirit that Diderot developed his ideas on the drame bourgeois, the bourgeois drama. In his essays and dialogues, he argued passionately for a new kind of play, one that focused not on kings and gods, but on merchants, artisans, and common citizens. These figures, with their familiar struggles and ordinary virtues, could teach audiences more about humanity and morality than 1,000 tales of mythic grandeur. His theoretical writings on the subject, particularly the treatise The Paradox of the Actor, laid the foundations for modern ideas of realism in theater. Diderot proposed that actors should not simply feel emotions, but should masterfully simulate them, maintaining an inner detachment even as they stirred the audience's passions. It was a radical departure from conventional wisdom, suggesting that art achieved its highest power not through spontaneity, but through disciplined illusion. Eager to embody his theories in practice, Diderot turned playwright. He composed works such as Le Fils Naturel and Le Père de Famille, dramas that place private virtue and domestic tensions at their center. In these plays, there were no grandiose declamations, no supernatural interventions, only families navigating love, duty, and honor within the fabric of everyday life. The dialogue was naturalistic, the characters flawed but recognizable, and the moral questions rich and unresolved. Yet translating theory into theatrical success proved elusive. When Le Fils Naturel was finally staged, it met with tepid public response. Audiences, still attuned to the grand spectacles of Racine and Corneille, struggled to appreciate Diderot's quieter, subtler vision. Critics were divided. Some praised the honesty and innovation of his work, while others dismissed it as pedestrian and sentimental. Undeterred, Diderot continued to champion the cause of bourgeois drama in essays, letters, and conversations. The modest reception of his plays did not diminish their significance. Over time, Diderot's theatrical theories would ripple outward, influencing dramatists far beyond the borders of France. His insistence on portraying middle-class life with dignity helped to lay the groundwork for later realist traditions in European theater, from the domestic dramas of Ibsen to the psychological explorations of Chekhov. Beyond the stage, Diderot's aesthetic theories extended into the realm of painting and sculpture. He became one of the earliest and most insightful art critics, attending the Paris salons and penning vivid, often ecstatic reviews. In his critiques, he celebrated artists who captured the subtleties of emotion and the textures of daily life, favoring works that moved the soul over those that merely dazzled the eye. His writings transformed art criticism from a catalog of judgments into a lively, imaginative form of literature. For Diderot, whether in drama, painting, or sculpture, the highest purpose of art was not to flatter the senses, but to awaken conscience and empathy. Art should teach people to feel more deeply and to live more nobly. This conviction infused all his creative work during this period, imbuing it with an earnestness and generosity that set him apart from many of his more cynical contemporaries. In pursuing these new creative avenues, Diderot demonstrated once again the restless breadth of his mind. He was no mere encyclopedist or polemicist. He was a man determined to explore every frontier where ideas and life could meet. Through theater and aesthetic theory, he expanded his intellectual kingdom, revealing dimensions of his spirit that were as passionate, inventive, and profound as any he had yet disclosed. By the mid-1760s, Denis Diderot's reputation had traveled beyond the salons and streets of Paris. His name, carried by whispered admiration and cautious controversy, reached the courts and drawing rooms of Europe's most powerful monarchs. For a man who had once struggled to keep his family fed through translations and pamphlets, it was a curious evolution. Now rulers themselves sought his counsel, intrigued by the sharp mind that dared to map the vast terrains of human knowledge. The invitation came from an unlikely patron, Catherine II of Russia, later celebrated as Catherine the Great. An admirer of Enlightenment thought, she saw in Diderot not merely a scholar, but a potential advisor, someone who could help her reform her sprawling, semi-feudal empire. Through a flurry of correspondence, she urged him to leave France, offering safe passage and generous patronage. At first hesitant, Diderot eventually accepted, compelled by both curiosity and necessity. The sale of his library, purchased by Catherine with the agreement that he would act as its curator for life, had provided him with financial stability, but also bound him to her service. The journey eastward was arduous. Crossing Germany and Poland in uncomfortable carriages, Diderot witnessed firsthand the social and political conditions that would later temper some of his idealism. The endless stretches of poor villages, the heavy hand of local aristocracies, the visible scars of war and despotism. These impressions carved themselves into his mind, deepening his understanding of the gulf between philosophical dreams and political realities. Arriving in St. Petersburg in 1773, Diderot was greeted with all the splendor the Russian court could muster. Lavish feasts, glittering balls, and formal audiences awaited him. Yet for all the outward pomp, Diderot remained inwardly critical. He recognized that the empress's reforms were often symbolic, constrained by the entrenched power of the nobility and the vast inertia of tradition. Nevertheless, he approached his role with energy, engaging in long, candid conversations with Catherine, sometimes even arguing heatedly when he perceived contradictions between her Enlightenment rhetoric and her political actions. Their meetings became legendary. Diderot, abandoning the cautious flattery expected of court philosophers, spoke to the empress as he would to a peer. He urged her to abolish serfdom, to redistribute land, to create a society founded on reason and justice. Catherine, amused but immovable on many points, listened with polite attention, often deflecting his more radical proposals with wit and regal patience. Still, she valued his passion and intelligence, and their exchanges influenced the intellectual tone of her reign, if not its policies. Beyond the court, Diderot's Russian sojourn exposed him to a cultural world very different from Paris. He attended theatrical performances where Western classics were awkwardly adapted to Russian tastes, visited artists striving to blend European techniques with native traditions, and met scholars laboring to modernize an educational system burdened by medieval remnants. In all of this, he saw both the promise and the peril of exporting Enlightenment ideals wholesale into vastly different soils. After several months, Diderot's health, always delicate, began to falter. The endless ceremonies, the bitter cold, and the emotional strain took their toll. With a mixture of relief and regret, he prepared for the long journey back to France. Catherine, ever magnanimous, loaded him with honors and gifts, securing his lasting gratitude even as he departed with lingering doubts about the ultimate triumph of reason in politics. Returning to Paris, Diderot found himself changed. His experiences abroad had broadened his vision, but also sobered his optimism. He had seen the limitations of ideas when confronted with entrenched power, the compromises leaders made between ideals and pragmatism. He had tasted the bittersweet reality that true reform was slower, messier, and more painful than the pages of philosophy ever suggested. Nevertheless, Diderot did not retreat into cynicism. Instead, he deepened his commitment to the power of culture, conversation, and art to effect gradual change. In his letters and writings, he continued to advocate for a future built not merely by rulers' decrees, but by the slow awakening of a more educated, more empathetic humanity. The voyage to Russia had not fulfilled Diderot's loftiest hopes, but it had enriched his understanding of the world's complexities. It added new layers of experience to his thought, sharpening his insights and lending his later works a richness born of direct engagement with the stubborn realities of history. Far from the ivory tower, Diderot had walked into the courts of power and emerged, battered but wiser, still faithful to the restless light of the Enlightenment. As Denis Diderot entered the final decade of his life, Paris seemed to whirl faster around him, animated by new revolutions in thought, fashion, and politics. Yet for the aging philosopher, the rhythms of daily life began to slow. The battles of the encyclopedia were behind him. The grand journeys concluded. Now, in modest apartments filled with books, manuscripts, and modest tokens from distant friends, Diderot settled into a period of reflection and personal writing. Turning inward even as the world he helped reshape moved inexorably toward upheaval. His days became a carefully arranged tapestry of routine. Mornings were devoted to reading and contemplation, afternoons to writing letters and essays, and evenings often to intimate conversations with a small circle of trusted friends. No longer the restless figure dashing from one printer to another under the eyes of censors, Diderot embraced a quieter, more deliberate intellectual life. Yet within the apparent calm, his mind burned no less brightly. Indeed, his later works revealed a depth and subtlety born of decades of observation and struggle. Among the fruits of this period was Jacques the Fatalist and his Master, a novel unlike any that had come before it. Playful, digressive, often baffling in structure, it defied the conventions of narrative storytelling. Characters debated philosophy, fate, and morality even as the plot wandered through tangents and interruptions. Beneath the surface, humor lay profound questions about human freedom and the nature of existence. It was a work that reflected a lifetime's skepticism, tempered by wit and a wry, humane compassion. In parallel, Diderot composed dialogues and essays that bore the mark of philosophical maturity. His D'Alembert's Dream, a fictional conversation between thinkers and scientists, delved into speculative materialism, envisioning the universe as a vast, dynamic interplay of matter without divine intervention. These writings were often too daring for publication in his lifetime. Diderot shared them cautiously, in manuscript form, among a circle of confidants, aware that public release could provoke renewed persecution. Family occupied an increasingly central place in Diderot's final years. His relationship with his daughter, Angelique, grew especially tender. He poured into his letters to her a mixture of practical advice, philosophical musings, and affectionate humor. To Angelique, he was no longer merely the towering intellectual, but the devoted, if sometimes worried, father, encouraging her education, counseling her marriage choices, and reminding her always to cultivate independent thought. Friendships, too, sustained him. Longtime companions such as Grimm, who edited and disseminated Diderot's works across Europe, remained loyal correspondents. Through letters, Diderot extended his intellectual reach far beyond Paris, engaging in ongoing dialogues about science, art, and morality with distant interlocutors. Though his physical world had contracted, his mental world remained vast and teeming with life. Physically, Diderot felt the slow encroachments of age. His health, never robust, began to decline visibly. Yet he resisted the temptations of despair. He accepted the approach of mortality with a stoic cheerfulness, finding solace in the thought that ideas, once released into the world, had a life beyond their authors. His role, as he saw it, had been to contribute a stone to the edifice of reason and to trust that others would continue the building. Despite his pivotal role in the Enlightenment, Diderot remained largely uncelebrated in official circles during his lifetime. He received no public honors, no sinecures from the state, but he harbored no illusions on that score. He understood too well the uneasy relationship between truth and power. His satisfaction lay elsewhere, in the quiet triumph of having remained faithful to the calling of a free mind. As the 1780s progressed, the political and social tensions that would culminate in the French Revolution began to crackle ominously through France. Diderot, ever perceptive, sensed the coming storm but did not live to see its full fury. Yet in many ways, the revolution was the child of the ideas he and his peers had tirelessly sown. His insistence on questioning authority, on elevating reason over tradition, had planted seeds that would soon erupt into history with violent force. In the end, Denis Diderot's final years were not a retreat, but a culmination, a period where the scattered threads of his life wove into a coherent tapestry. Philosopher, critic, father, friend, he had lived fully in the life of the mind and the heart, challenging his age and leaving behind a legacy as rich, complicated, and enduring as the Enlightenment itself. Denis Diderot's life ended quietly on July 31st, 1784, in his Parisian apartment. The man who had spent his entire existence appending the old orders, challenging traditions, and championing the light of reason had passed away, but his ideas, like the revolution that was soon to explode across France, were already alive and in motion. The irony of Diderot's final moments was that he, who had pushed so vigorously for the emancipation of human thought, would not live to see the full scope of the change he had helped foster. By the time of his death, the seeds he had sown with his work on the Encyclopedia had sprouted into full-blown societal change. The intellectual atmosphere in Europe was charged, particularly in France, where Enlightenment ideas, though often twisted and politicized, had become the foundation for the storming of the Bastille in 1789 and the subsequent rise of the French Revolution. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, of whom Diderot had been one of the most daring and influential, had lit the spark of reform and reimagined human society. Their voices, once voices of dissent, were now seen as harbingers of a new age. Yet Diderot's influence did not end with the revolution. The vast scope of his intellectual legacy rippled across disciplines. As one of the founding figures of modern materialism, his ideas continued to shape scientific and philosophical discourse. His deep engagement with empirical observation and rational thinking paved the way for the development of the natural sciences. His skepticism of religious and metaphysical explanations also set the stage for the development of secular thought in the centuries to come. In the realm of art and aesthetics, Diderot's critical writings became a cornerstone of art criticism. His observations on the role of emotion and truth in art set the framework for future critics and artists who would follow his principles of realism. The modern concept of the artist as a thinker, someone whose work embodies intellectual and emotional depth, owes much to Diderot's championing of this idea. He understood that art was not merely a form of decoration, but a serious pursuit capable of expressing the truths of the human condition. His plays, though not widely performed during his lifetime, gained appreciation in later years for their revolutionary approach to drama. The drame bourgeois, with its focus on ordinary lives and moral dilemmas, laid the groundwork for future playwrights, from Ibsen to Chekhov, who would continue to challenge the conventions of theater. Diderot's notion of acting, where emotion was simulated rather than deeply felt, would also influence methods of theatrical performance well into the 20th century. Though Diderot never sought fame, his intellectual contributions were undeniable. His encyclopedia was not just an informational project, but a cultural statement. It was a declaration of belief in human progress and the capacity of reason to illuminate the darkest corners of society. Despite being censored, attacked, and even imprisoned for his efforts, the encyclopedia survived, and with it, the enduring spirit of the Enlightenment. In his final years, Diderot had come to terms with the paradox of his existence. He was a revolutionary in a world that was slow to embrace change, and yet he had given birth to ideas that would eventually transform that world. He had faced the harshest of circumstances, imprisonment, poverty, and personal loss, but he had emerged with an unshakable faith in the power of human intellect and reason. His life was a testament to the value of perseverance in the face of adversity, to the importance of thinking critically, and to the duty of every human being to question the authority and assumptions that govern their world. Upon his death, Diderot's legacy was not immediately celebrated. Unlike Voltaire, whose funeral was a public spectacle, Diderot's passing was relatively quiet. It was only later that the true magnitude of his contributions to philosophy, literature, and the sciences came to be recognized. His works continued to circulate, read, and admired by those who came after him. His influence was felt not only in the intellectual movements that followed, but also in the political revolutions that swept across Europe, where his call for liberty, equality, and fraternity took root. In the decades after his death, historians, philosophers, and political thinkers began to see Diderot not only as a key figure of the French Enlightenment, but as a prescient advocate of progress and rationalism. His contributions to human thought helped chart a course that would eventually lead to the abolition of the monarchy, the rise of secularism, and the broader acceptance of scientific inquiry as the path to understanding the world. His ideas, much like his own life, were too vast to be confined to a single era or nation. They resonated across centuries, influencing the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the intellectual currents that have shaped modern Western thought. Though Diderot's body lies in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, his mind lives on in the books he left behind and the intellectual revolutions he set in motion. Today, his name stands as a symbol of the boundless possibilities of human reason, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and truth, no matter the cost, is an endeavor worth undertaking. The man who once wrote of changing the world with ideas achieved just that, leaving an indelible mark on the course of history. Through his works, his ideas continue to spark debate, inspire new generations, and challenge all who dare to think freely.